So we're going to try to hear from Amparo Domingo. She's the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact in Spain, and she's going to talk to us about the SOGI report. So that's sexual orientation and gender identity. So at the UN, they're trying to prioritize the discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and make that take over from discrimination against sex. So Amparo is going to talk to us about that.
So I'm going to talk to you about the latest report by the United Nations independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, a position that was created by the UN Human Rights Council, and it's supported by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. This is the webpage of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the UN, and they have this section for the independent expert. As you see, it's about protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is a quite recent development, and since the creation of this post, there have been 2 mandate holders, both of them signatories of Yoga Carta Plus, the 2017 enhancement of the Yoga Carta principles, which is in itself an important piece of information in the field of this mandate, and makes you wonder about the definition of this position as independent. This is Victor Madrigal Borloo, when he was not yet the independent expert, but he was congratulating himself of the launch and signatory of the Yoga Carta principles. I mean, this is public, well-known information. So I recommend to all of you to look at the information related to this position at the UN and check all the reports and surveys carried out so far. It's very enlightening, and it explains, for instance, why the sudden interest of many governments in the world for the so-called conversion therapy practices, which was one of the topics addressed by this expert a while ago. The report I'm talking about today is the most recent. It was launched a couple of months ago, and it's about gender theory, for which the expert launched a call for submissions this past February, in which we can read, if you have that on your screen. The gender theory-informed approaches recognize gender as inextricably linked with social constructs, that the meanings attached to sex and other differences are socially created. But then he goes on. They challenge the assumption that gender identity necessarily correlates with biological sex and recognize the validity of a wide range of sexual orientations and gender identities. That is, the word gender is used in different ways in consecutive sentences. Gender as a system of roles attributed to both sexes, but also gender seems to be a part of an inner identity, gender identity, hence creating confusion about the goals and scope of the report. One of the questions of the survey was, who are main actors who argue that the defenders of human rights of LGBT individuals are furthering a so-called gender ideology? What are the main arguments? That was one of the questions of the survey. And he went on asking whether have their strategies directly or indirectly also impacted on the human rights of women and girls. This is very relevant since later in the report, feminist voices promoting sex-based rights are depicted in the report as antagonistic and hateful as the very conservative or religious frameworks. This is the page where you can consult the report. It has been issued in 2 parts. Well, the first one, the law of inclusion, and the second one, practices of exclusion, which is a very smart, though interesting, way of presenting the information by qualifying it depending on what this expert wants to pass as positive or negative. For instance, all legislation and jurisprudence that officially recognizes the concept of gender identity appears in the first part because it's considered to be inclusive. While the legislation that privileges sex-based rights, for instance, one of the examples he gives in his report, the new laws in different states in the US that ban transgender males in the female category in sports are given as examples of exclusionary. It won't be a surprise to you to know that the WHRC principles are mentioned in the first part of the report, it's a positive one, as a very relevant and prominent international human rights document without any disclaimer about the relation of the expert to them. Also not surprising are the recommendations of this expert as conclusion of his research in favor of self-ID, to the point that he says that the requirements of medical certification, surgery, or treatment are considered abusive or even torture, according to this expert. By conflating sexual orientation and gender identity, including condition of differences in sexual development referred to in the report as intersex, examples of rampant homophobia or violence against lesbians is considered as bad as defending sex-based rights because that would exclude males who alleged to have a female gender identity from the category of woman. I have here some examples of those exclusions he quotes, and one of the exclusions is the adoption of legislation and policies prohibiting the distribution of information on LGBT persons to children, as is happening in the Russian Federation, Hungary, and Kazakhstan, which are countries that are very homophobic. And then, following that, he mentions the adoption of state-level legislation barring participation of trans women in women and girls sports as in the United States. So those two very different examples are given at the same level in this report. So the use of hyperbolic language is not an exception but the norm in this report, where it is even stated that what the critical voices are really saying is that the existence of trans-identified males, called trans women in the report, are a threat to cis women. He says that their very existence are a threat. It's mirroring the narratives of transgender activists. The use of language in the report is extremely interesting, where all the points that the expert wants to pass as positive and inclusive and cited are stated in a very firm and categoric language, like this: the governments must do this, they have to, they are imperative, where the critics to gender identity appear vague or groundless. For instance, we have that he says that he has provided ample evidence. He speaks about when he was to pass something as negative, he says it's, they face cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. But then when feminists are saying that women's sports are under threat, he speaks about alleged threats. So it's a very different nuance and a very different way of depicting the information. There's a part of the report about alleged impact on children and women's rights, on alleged impact on children's rights, and then alleged impact on women's and girls' sport. In those sections, feminist objections to gender identity appear, including Sheila Jeffries. She makes it into in a form of a footnote when she was it's at the part of the gender ideology forces lesbian women to enter into relationships with trans women. That's his wording, or else be labeled transphobic. So because he's talking about LGBT rights and he cannot go against lesbians openly here, the way he words this, instead of being very categorical as other examples, he says that the mandate folder sees no reason why this framework would not be adequate for the relationship. He's talking about consent. So it's a very different way of presenting his already conclusions before starting the survey, to the submissions received by feminists. I'm about to finish. I want you to see something very interesting because the experts in presenting gender identities as a very positive development in our society take him to state that the categories of male and female are a consequence of colonialism. So I wanted you to see that because you might not believe me if I tell you. So this is at the page 12 of the second report, Practices of Exclusion. He didn't say the binary of masculinity and femininity. Male, female binary. That is a consequence of colonialism. This is something he points in the executive report of the briefing of this report. It says that gender is a supra-biological phenomenon. So it's no longer a society construct, it's not a social construct, it's a phenomenon. Phenomena happen in the natural world, but this is supra-biological phenomenon. And this is a UN document. So that's supra-biological phenomenon at the same time that he states like that without any consideration that some of the submissions were excluded. He didn't like them. They were hateful. Those submissions were excluded. Just like that. So those submissions won't appear anywhere. So with all that, I think, or we're beginning to see that this amount, it's a living example of Procrustes, a character from Greek mythology. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Procrustes had an iron bed for his victims. He compelled them to lie there. And if a victim was shorter than the bed, he stretched him by hammering or racking the body to fit. Alternatively, if the victim was longer than the bed, he cut off the legs to make the body fit the bed's length. In either event, the victim died. So it was either stretching to fit the mold or cutting everything that didn't fit the mold, as we have seen with these last two examples. So the expression Procrustean bed, according to Britannica, is proverbial for arbitrarily and perhaps ruthlessly forcing someone or something to fit into an unnatural scheme or pattern. So it is sex, not gender, what defines women. That's the natural scheme of things. Thank you very much.